Hey there, night owls. Welcome back. Tonight's story is about a life most people never think about, but everyone secretly fears. Being a servant in a medieval noble's house. Not the glamorous, candlelit fantasy kind. We're talking blistered hands, endless chores, and being yelled at because the Lord's bathwater is 1 degree too cold. You think your job sucks now? Imagine scrubbing armor with vinegar, carrying poop buckets through banquet halls, and sleeping next to rats that steal your blanket. You get yelled at for breathing too loudly, and rewarded with half a turnip and a sarcastic nod. So, before we begin, and before you get too comfortable, hit that like and subscribe button if you genuinely enjoy the content I create. And tell me in the comments, what city and country are you watching from? And what time is it right now where you are? Seriously, I love seeing all the responses from around the world. It's wild, knowing so many of you are tuning in from so many corners of the globe. Now, dim the lights, maybe grab a snack that isn't soaked in medieval stew water, and get ready. This is how awful it was to be a medieval servant in a noble's house. You walk in through the side entrance, not the grand archway with banners fluttering and guests being announced with trumpets, the one by the stables that smells like wet hay and regret. A door so small you have to duck, and even then, it creaks like it doesn't want you there. Because it doesn't. That's your introduction to the noble house you now serve, not in the dignified, handshake and uniform kind of way. Congratulations, you belong to us now. There's no welcome, no instructions, just a shout from somewhere above. You! Take this to the kitchen, and now you're carrying a sack of something squishy that may or may not be eels. You're not sure. You're too scared to check. You see, medieval noble houses weren't homes. They were machines. Gigantic, chaotic, pride-fueled machines run by two things: ego and fear. The nobles ran on ego. You, and everyone like you, ran on fear. And the moment you entered that house, you were no longer a person. You were part of the furniture, movable, replaceable, preferably quiet. Your first job isn't glamorous. Actually, none of them are. But this one sets the tone. Scrubbing soot from the hearth with a rag that has clearly seen too many winters. The room is already full of smoke, the walls stained with centuries of fires, and every breath tastes like burnt bacon and despair. You scrub until your arms tremble, until your knees hurt from kneeling on stone, until someone finally says, "That'll do." Not "well done," not "thank you," just "that'll do." You don't have a room, not really. Servants sleep wherever the noble doesn't. Under stairs, behind doors, in storage closets with flour sacks and mice for company. You get a straw mattress, if you're lucky, and a thin blanket that doesn't remember the concept of warmth. You keep your shoes on, not for comfort, but because someone else might take them. There are rules, unspoken ones. Don't talk unless spoken to. Don't make eye contact unless you're cleaning their boots. Don't ever, under any circumstance, sit in the wrong chair. That's how you get kicked. Or worse, noticed. And in this place, being noticed is not a reward. It's a warning. You learn to walk softly. You learn which floorboards squeak and which doors you can open without making a sound. You memorize everyone's favorite food, their mood swings, how they like their letters folded, what direction they face when they sleep. You become invisible. Because being invisible is safer than being memorable. This is your welcome. Not with kindness, with chores, with cold hands, with shouted orders and silence. You didn't get a badge. You got a bruise from carrying the wrong firewood. You didn't get trained. You got scolded until you figured it out, and you didn't enter a household. You entered a hierarchy, one where your only value is how well you suffer quietly, and that was day one. You didn't fill out an application. You didn't have an interview. There was no smiling steward saying, "Welcome aboard." No one ever said, "We're excited to have you join our team," because this wasn't a job. This was survival. This was what happened when the world decided you were too poor to be anything else. Hiring process looked more like this. Your father drank away the harvest, the landlord raised the rent again, your older brother died in a mining collapse, and suddenly your name was offered up like a sacrifice at the village meeting. Send the girl. The noble house always needs help. And just like that, your life belonged to someone else. Or maybe you were an orphan, and not the kind from bedtime stories. The real kind. The kind found cold and coughing on the chapel steps, offered to the steward not out of kindness, but obligation. They said she's old enough to carry a broom, and that was enough. You could stand, you could scrub. Some were debt payments. Your mother borrowed grain during the long winter, and when spring came and the debt collector showed up, she didn't have money. But she had a daughter, and now you belong to the manor. Congratulations, you're the interest. Others were born into it, a legacy, they called it. Your father polished boots, your mother scrubbed linens, and now you do both, with no days off and no inheritance. Just the same name sewn into the same apron, with the same tired fingers that no one will remember. And once you were in the house, that was it. You were in, not as a guest, not even as a resident, as furniture. Replaceable, movable, expected to function and make no noise. If you spoke out of turn, you were insolent. If you stayed quiet, you were suspicious. If you smiled, why? What are you plotting? You weren't allowed opinions. You weren't allowed dreams. You weren't allowed to fall in love, unless it was with the wrong person, in which case you'd be blamed for seducing them. Nobles loved blaming you for their own sins. You existed to absorb shame, anger, wine spills, and the occasional thrown goblet. The worst part? You began to believe it. After weeks, months, years of being told your place, you started to think maybe this was your place. Maybe this cold stone hallway and this cracked bowl of soup was all you'd ever deserve. And maybe, just maybe, if you worked hard enough, long enough, and kept your head down, someone might remember your name. They wouldn't. But you hoped anyway, because that's what the system was built on. Not ambition, not opportunity, hope. The soft, cruel kind that keeps you moving just enough to never stop, never ask, never run. Not that you could. Where would you go? No, you didn't choose this job. You were born into a world where choice was a luxury for people who used knives to cut roast beef, not rope to tie their aprons. And this job? It chose you the moment you learned how to bow your head. In the grand pecking order of medieval nobility, even servants had ranks. Not because the work got better, but because nobles needed to know exactly who to punish when the soup was too cold or their shoe went missing. Titles existed for the same reason castles had dungeons, to keep the chaos organized. Let's begin at the absolute bottom, the scullion. If you were a scullion, you were human residue. The one who scrubbed pots that had been burned so often they had their own personalities. You were soaked in grease, covered in soot, and by the end of every shift so hunched your silhouette looked like a question mark. Not even the other servants spoke to you unless they needed something scraped, carried, or blamed. Just above that, you had kitchen boys and spit boys. These weren't jobs, they were punishments assigned to boys young enough not to cry too loud. You sat by an open fire for hours, turning a roasting pig while your hands blistered and your eyes stung. If you fainted, the roast burned. If the roast burned, you got kicked, or replaced, or both. Then came the chambermaids and laundry girls who had the unique privilege of cleaning everything nobles touched. Everything. Beds, basins, bodily fluids. You learned early that dignity was a luxury and silence was a shield. You were in every room where secrets happened, and you carried those secrets like stones sewn into your hem. There was the footman, whose main job was to stand still, look pretty, and occasionally carry trays heavy enough to dislocate a shoulder. It was a role born entirely from nobility needing something vaguely human to decorate their halls with. You weren't supposed to speak, think, or blink too loudly. You were decor with knees. The housekeeper, butler, or steward. Now, those sounded noble. People might even bow to you. But the truth, you just had a longer list of problems. Instead of scrubbing pots, you now managed 30 people who did. You became a manager of misery, passing down complaints from above and curses from below. If a noble's jeweled belt went missing, you were the first accused. And if it reappeared, no one apologized. They just moved on. And then there were the ceremonial titles. Cupbearer, master of the pantry, keeper of the wardrobe. It sounds like something from a children's fantasy, doesn't it? But it wasn't magical. It was logistical. Your job was to remember how many forks the Duchess owned and who borrowed her lace gloves last Tuesday. If a towel disappeared, your mastery was questioned. If a mouse chewed the pantry oats, your loyalty was suspect. Titles didn't protect you. They categorized your usefulness. And when things went wrong, which they always did, titles gave nobles someone to blame faster. And you had better respond, or someone else would, and they'd throw you under the nearest cartwheel. The higher you rose, the more dangerous it became. Because visibility meant responsibility, and responsibility meant risk. A higher title just meant the blade came down slower, but harder. So yes, you had a title. You wore it like a collar, polished, public, tight. And every time someone said it, you remembered exactly who you were. Let's talk about the money. Or, more accurately, let's talk about the ghost of money, because that's all you ever saw. Being a servant in a medieval noble house wasn't a job. It was a deal. The noble says, "Do absolutely everything I ask, no matter how degrading, exhausting, or life-threatening, and I might let you sleep near the hearth and give you what's left of dinner if the dog's not hungry." That's the contract. Verbal, unwritten, irrevocable. Forget wages. Actual, regular coins. Only the elite staff, the steward, the master cook, the head butler, might see a few silver pennies every few months. Everyone else, you got paid in leftovers, sore feet, and second-hand shoes with someone else's sweat still stitched into the leather. Your payment came in 3 forms. 1, food, not yours, theirs. You ate only after the nobility had their fill. If there was bread left, you got it. If not, you had broth, a watery grave for the week's regrets. Occasionally, some cook would sneak you a scrap of meat. Not because you earned it, because they pitied the hollow look in your eyes. 2, shelter. And by shelter, they meant you could sleep in a space the size of a cupboard with 10 other servants. No mattress. Just straw that had seen more fleas than the local kennel. No privacy, no windows, just the blessed darkness of exhaustion. If it rained, the roof leaked. If it snowed, you shivered in your shift and wrapped yourself in a wet cloak that smelled like firewood and failure. 3, gratitude. Not spoken, definitely not written. Just the vague sense that you hadn't been thrown out yet. Maybe once, if you did something really impressive like save a child from falling into a well or clean blood out of a tunic without staining the embroidery, you'd get a coin. A single coin, copper, dented, still warm from their greasy fingers. But you couldn't ask for more, ever. Asking meant questioning the system. It meant saying, "I am a human being with needs," and that didn't go down well in houses where even the horses ate better than the scullions. And God's help you if a noble guest felt generous and tossed a coin at you like you were some sort of performing monkey. You were expected to bow, smile, and thank them as you scrambled on all fours across a marble floor, just to grab a piece of metal worth half a turnip. You didn't just take the coin, you accepted your place. There were no savings. What would you save? You had no place to hide money, no reason to hoard it. And even if you did, someone would steal it. Probably another servant, because everyone was desperate, everyone was hungry, and everyone knew no one was coming to help. There was no ladder, no pension, no quiet retirement in a cottage by the woods. You worked until you dropped. And when you dropped, someone else stepped over you and picked up your rag, your tray, your roll. So no, you didn't thrive. You endured. You outlasted. You ate enough to wake up the next day and tried not to think about how much your body ached for a world that didn't exist. Because thriving was for lords. Surviving, barely, was for you. From the outside, the noble's house looks like something out of a bard's song. Tall towers, glinting stonework, colorful banners flapping in the wind. A place of power, elegance, wealth. But you don't live outside, you live inside. And from inside, it doesn't look like a castle. It looks like a labyrinth built by a madman with a grudge against shoes, backs, and dignity. The ceilings are too low in the servant halls, but too high in the noble ones, so your neck hurts no matter where you are. The corridors are narrow, twisted, and designed by someone who had never considered the idea of moving quickly without smashing your shin on something. You wake before dawn and navigate the back halls with a candle stub and pure muscle memory. One wrong step, and you've tripped over a dog, slipped on a puddle of who knows what, or slammed your hip into an armoire that hasn't been moved since the last plague. The kitchen? It's not a workplace, it's a furnace with walls. The hearth burns day and night. You dodge boiling water, flying grease, and cooks with zero regard for your personal space. One of them once stabbed a chicken so hard the blade snapped, kept using it anyway. You carry trays full of goblets and gravy across polished stone floors, slicker than wet ice. You balance bowls stacked higher than your head. If one drops, that's it. You don't just lose your dignity, you lose dinner. And in this place, dinner is survival. There are stairs, too many stairs, and none of them are safe. Some lean, some creak, some are so narrow you have to turn sideways just to get through. And if your candle goes out while carrying laundry up the East Wing spiral staircase, may the saints guide your soul, because nobody else will. Every room is a hazard. Nobles love carpets, and you learn fast that those elegant rugs are just waiting to fold under your foot and send you crashing head first into a suit of armor that hasn't been dusted since the First Crusade. Chandeliers hang too low. Tapestries hide doorways. Fireplaces explode in sparks. Curtains catch flames. Chimneys belch soot like the devil's own breath. One time, a chambermaid opened a window in the middle of winter, and the frost on the inside fell on her like daggers. She lost a toe. They named it her fault. And don't forget the animals. Dogs, horses, falcons, all technically the noble's beloved companions. But to you, they're landmines with fur. The greyhound bites, the falcon screams, the horse kicks. The cat, you don't even see it until it's under your foot and suddenly you're face first in manure. And that's just the physical dangers. There are the nobles themselves. They don't yell, they shriek, they throw things. One dropped a silver dish that bounced off a wall and shattered a servant's front tooth. He should have caught it, they said. The house doesn't care if you live or die. It doesn't care if you break a bone, lose a finger, or pass out from heat stroke. It was never built with you in mind. You're not the one it was meant to impress. You're the one who disappears into it, who scrubs it, fuels it, feeds it. To guests, it's a monument. To you, it's a machine. Cold, grinding. And if it swallows you, it won't even pause. If you thought the house itself was dangerous, just wait until you meet the people inside it. Nobles, lords, ladies, the elite. Your bosses, technically, though that word suggests structure, professionalism, maybe a performance review. No, these weren't bosses. These were crowned children in embroidered robes who had never lifted a bucket, cleaned a chamber pot, or gone a day without someone else making their food, dressing them, and heating their bath with water carried on your back. Meet Lady Entitled. She sleeps in until noon, complains that the porridge isn't golden enough, and once screamed because her slippers weren't warm. Her day consists of brushing her hair, with your help, sighing at windows and ordering things she doesn't want just so someone else has to carry them. She has emotions, many of them, and all of them are your fault. If she's angry, you didn't arrange her garments correctly. If she's sad, someone dusted the wrong mirror. If she's bored, well, that's a hanging offense. Then there's Lord Never Satisfied. He walks like he owns the world because, in a way, he does, and you're part of the property. You bow before he enters. You bow when he passes. You bow when he leaves. And if you forget, you're punished. Not necessarily immediately, sometimes they wait. Let it stew, let you sweat. Lord Never Satisfied has opinions about everything. Your posture, your pace, your voice. One day, he likes you silent. The next, he calls you dull and demands you speak more clearly. Then, he accuses you of being too familiar. You don't win, you adapt or vanish. Noble children, tiny tyrants in training. Raised by nannies and praised by sycophants, they treat servants like toys. They demand piggyback rides, then scream when you're too slow. They hide your tools, lie about your actions, and once dumped chamber pot water into a maid's bed just to see what would happen. What happened? Nothing. Because they're nobles, you got scolded for encouraging it. You see, these people weren't employers. They were reality distorters. They believed comfort was their right and suffering was your duty. They expected perfection from people who hadn't eaten breakfast. They treated exhaustion as laziness, illness as inconvenience, and fear as a performance flaw. They didn't ask, they commanded. And if they did ask, that was worse. That meant they were in a mood, a dangerous one. Because when a noble got curious, someone got blamed. They might smile in front of guests, speak gently to priests, even pretend to care about the servants on a feast day. But the moment the door closed, the real face came out. Cold, entitled, sharp as the knife they once made you polish for 2 hours, only to throw it on the floor because it looked too shiny. There were no boundaries. Nobles would walk into the kitchen and demand a snack, into the servant quarters and inspect the bedding, into the garden and shout because the air felt damp. You were always on edge, always in danger of being in the wrong place at the wrong time, doing exactly what they told you to do, but now, apparently, doing it wrong. You didn't serve people, you served power, and power didn't apologize. It broke you, thanked itself, and rang the bell for supper. There was no such thing as a typical day for a medieval servant. Every sunrise brought a new disaster, a new demand, and at least one chance to lose your position, or your fingers. But if you had to put it in a timeline, here's how it went. First light, you're already late. Before the roosters had time to scream, you're on your feet, pulling on stiff, damp clothes in the dark. There's no candle unless you stole one, and if you stole one, you'd better have a good hiding spot, because if they find it, you're a thief. And thieves don't get warning letters. They get ropes. You start with fires. Every hearth in the house needs to be lit. That means hauling wood. Upstairs, down halls, across slippery floors, before you've had a single bite to eat. If you're lucky, you manage to relight the East Wing's fireplace before the lady complains that the air feels unfriendly. Next, water. Buckets and buckets of it. For washing, for drinking, for soaking, Lord Never Satisfied's sore feet because he's decided he has a nobleman's gout. Doesn't matter that the well is half a courtyard away and the bucket handle bites into your fingers like it's hungry. Then come the animals. Feed the horses, milk the cows, shovel what they leave behind. If you work in the stables, your entire morning is a ballet of mud, manure, and teeth, usually not your own. By mid-morning, the noble family begins to stir. This is when the chaos really starts. The breakfast has to be hot, the linens fresh, the shoes polished, the chamber pots, well, you already know. God help you if you make noise waking them up, or if the bath is cold, or if the tea is too hot. You'll be told you've ruined the morning, and that's just the beginning. If you serve in the kitchen, it's a non-stop furnace. You peel vegetables with a knife so dull it sighs when it touches the carrot. You stir stews that could feed 50, assuming 50 people don't mind the same gray gruel with a hint of yesterday. The cook screams. The fire roars. You're sweating into everything and praying no one notices. Lunchtime isn't for you. It's for them. You serve. You stand. You watch. You anticipate. The napkin, the extra salt, the sudden irrational demand for goat cheese that no one mentioned and doesn't exist. Someone spills something. You clean it. Someone says something awkward. You're suddenly invisible. By evening, you're still going. Dinner is a performance. Candles lit, platters carried, jugs refilled. Music playing from musicians who smell worse than you do. You move like a shadow, because being noticed now is dangerous. They're drinking. Drinking means talking. Talking means ego. Ego means someone's about to make a servant the butt of a joke. And the punchline is always pain. When the nobles retire, you clean up the mess. All of it. Food, spilled wine, broken plates, broken dignity. After that, mending, folding, sweeping. If you're still standing, you might eat. You crawl into bed, if it can be called that, as the stars fade. And if you're very lucky, you sleep. 4, maybe 5 hours before it starts all over again. It wasn't a job, it was a sentence. And your only crime was being born where you were. They say cleanliness is next to godliness. But if that's true, then every servant was one sweaty, bruised, half-starved saint. Because in a medieval noble's house, cleaning wasn't a task. It was an act of desperation. A losing battle fought daily with no end and no victory. You didn't clean for hygiene. That word didn't exist. You cleaned for appearances, for illusion. Because the noble family didn't want to see dirt, even if they lived in it. As long as the grime was out of sight, they believed they were pure. You were the one tasked with making filth invisible. There were rules. Unwritten, ever-changing rules. Don't leave streaks on the copper. Don't scrub so hard the paint comes off the tapestries. Don't forget the third stair in the west wing squeaks, if not waxed with pig fat. And if the lady sees a fingerprint on her mirror, even though she's the one who touched it, you're scrubbing chamber pots until your back snaps. And let's not even start on the privies. If hell has a scent, it's the inside of a medieval toilet after a feast day. Your job wasn't just to empty the pots, but to freshen them. With what? Herbs, dried flowers, anything to mask the scent of human suffering. You learned quickly that no bouquet on earth could undo what a nobleman's digestion could achieve. Some nobles fancied themselves enlightened and demanded lavender water for wiping, or that their wash basins be infused with restorative herbs. You, of course, prepared all of it, then watched them wipe their mouths with it after a roast pig and blame you for the bitter taste. Your hands were your tools, no gloves, just your raw, cracked, reddened hands. They were always wet, always aching, covered in lye, vinegar, ash, and things you stopped identifying for the sake of sanity. By age 20, your fingers looked 50. But the house wasn't your only battlefield. Your own body, that was another enemy. You weren't allowed to be dirty even while cleaning the filth of others. You couldn't stink, even though you hauled slop, scraped grease, and slept in sweat-soaked wool. You were expected to look presentable, even if you hadn't bathed in weeks and shared a wash basin with 6 other people and a cat that refused to leave. And if a noble caught a whiff of you, you were scolded for being offensive. Because nothing says hypocrisy like a man who hasn't changed his stockings in a month telling you that you smell like a dead otter. There were no breaks, no fresh clothes. You wore what you could find, mended it with scraps, layered it until it stopped falling apart. The same shift, the same apron, the same curse of feeling the grime in your bones even after washing. In the end, you realized something. You could never win at cleaning. You could only delay the inevitable. Dust would settle. Floors would stain. The house would rot from within slowly, like the pride of the family who lived in it. But every day you still rose, still picked up the broom, still scraped at the filth as if doing so might scrape away your place in the world. Because sometimes that's all hope is. Just the quiet belief that maybe tomorrow you'll leave the dirt behind. Even if you know you never will. 18 hours a day. That's how long you spent in the kitchen. And not 1 second of it was quiet, safe, or breathable. The kitchen wasn't just hot, it was angry. A growling, clanking, sweating beast that never stopped demanding. Flames roared like dragons behind every hearth. Grease hissed on pans the size of tables. The air was thick with steam, smoke, and the occasional scream. You coughed when you walked in. You coughed when you walked out. And sometimes you coughed until your vision went black and the floor came rushing up to greet you. But you got back up. Because there was no time to fall. Everyone had a job, and everyone was behind. The cook shouted from the moment the first log caught fire. She didn't speak in words. She used spoons, pots, and raw fury. If she called your name, you were already late. If she didn't, she expected you to read her mind, or be punished for not knowing what she hadn't said. You chopped onions until your fingers blistered, peeled root vegetables until your wrists felt like snapped twine, kneaded dough until the flour worked its way under your fingernails and stayed there for days. You stirred with wooden paddles so large they could double as oars, through pots so deep they could drown a child. Burns were common, small ones, big ones, the kind that never stopped peeling. You wore them like a uniform. No one had smooth hands. No one had clean fingernails. The new ones screamed the first time they touched a hot pot. The veterans didn't even flinch. It was constant movement. Firewood brought in, water hauled, ducks plucked, bread turned, pigs slaughtered, guts scraped. Every sound layered on top of the last. Knives chopping, flames cracking, boots stomping, cook shrieking. And above all, the bell, that cursed, clanging bell, demanding the next course, the next tray, the next miracle. And then the nobles would complain. This is cold. This is too salty. Why is the stew thin? Because you boiled it with your last breath, you wanted to say. Because the cook wept into it. Because the butcher brought bad meat and you couldn't say no. Because someone dropped the spices and you had to sweep them off the floor and still use them anyway. You never served. That was for the footmen. But you heard the feedback. Unimpressive. Overcooked? Bland? No one ever said, "Tell the kitchen thank you." They just pushed the plate aside and rang for something better. And when the meal was over, you didn't rest, you cleaned everything. Pots taller than your chest, pans so heavy they left bruises on your knees, trays black with soot, spills, bones, blood, grease, and all of it had to be scrubbed, dried, and stored silently before sunrise when the fire would be lit again. No one thanked you. No one asked if you'd eaten. You snuck crusts from under plates, licked gravy off spoons when no one looked. You were always starving, always sweating, always exhausted. The kitchen wasn't a room, it was a test, and most days you failed it, but kept showing up anyway. There are two things nobles produce in endless, astonishing quantities: complaints and laundry, and guess who has to deal with both? Laundry in a medieval noble house wasn't just a chore, it was an occupation, a calling, a full-time, soul-draining ritual of sweat, steam, and silent suffering. Every sheet, every undergarment, every ruined tablecloth from last night's wine-drenched tantrum had to be cleaned. By you. And if you think that sounds simple, then you've never tried to scrub blood, grease, and roast duck fat out of velvet, using nothing but cold water, soap made from animal fat, and a prayer whispered through clenched teeth. It started before sunrise. You gathered garments from every corner of the house. Floors, beds, banisters, and sometimes the garden hedges if the noble's teenage son had one of his episodes. Shirts crusted with sweat. Stockings stiff with filth. Linens stained with things no one talked about out loud. You didn't ask, you just collected. Then you carried it all, piles and piles, down to the washroom, or outside to the river, if your noble family was too frugal to build a proper basin. The wash house was cold, damp, and smelled like wet wool and regret. Your tools, a wooden tub, a club for beating cloth, and soap that stripped the skin from your knuckles faster than it did stains from the cloth. You spent hours, literal hours, bent over freezing water, scrubbing, soaking, rinsing, lifting, wringing, over and over. The same shirt 3 times because the lady said it smelled like last week's anxiety. You beat linens on rocks, hauled buckets until your shoulders screamed. Steam filled the room when hot water was available, which was rare, and your skin blistered if you stood too close. Then came drying. You hung things on ropes strung between rafters or branches, praying the weather didn't betray you. If it rained, the laundry got heavier. If it froze, the shirts turned into stiff corpses fluttering in the wind. Birds stole pieces. Dogs ran off with undergarments. Children trampled through the clean sheets because, of course, they did. After that, ironing, the medieval version, which meant heating a lump of iron in the fire and pressing it onto fabric while silently begging the wrinkles to cooperate. If you scorched something, you were doomed. If you burned your hand, which you did, there was no sympathy. Just another shirt to press. And folding? That was a performance. Nobles didn't want creases unless they were intentional. They wanted sheets folded like tapestries and socks rolled with military precision. One misaligned edge, and your entire day's work was declared sloppy and redone by you. Alone. At night. With your fingers trembling and your head spinning from heat, exhaustion, and the unbearable scent of lavender sachets you'll never afford. You didn't just clean laundry. You preserved the illusion of order in a world built on filth. And the worst part? Tomorrow it all starts again. Because nobles never run out of clothes. Only you do. There are many humiliations that come with being a medieval servant. Carrying rotting meat. Being screamed at over lukewarm bathwater. Getting slapped for stepping on the wrong side of a rug. But none of it compares to the daily horror show known as chamber pot duty. Let's not dress it up. The chamber pot was exactly what it sounds like. A bucket, bowl, or basin kept in noble bedrooms for their personal, nighttime emergencies. Because nobles didn't walk to the privy in the middle of the night like everyone else. That was peasant behavior. No, they did their business in gold-rimmed ceramic pots, and then you came to collect it. This wasn't once in a while. This was daily. You started your mornings not with bread, not with prayer, but by handling the steaming, reeking symbols of aristocratic laziness. You knocked softly, entered quickly, and prayed you wouldn't drop anything. Because if you spilled, that was the end. The end of your day, the end of your respect, possibly the end of your job. Every bedroom had at least one chamber pot, sometimes more. The lord had his, the lady had hers, the visiting cousin from across the valley had his, too, and his was usually full by dawn because he drank like a knight and ate like a pig. You carried them carefully, balancing them like sacred relics while your stomach turned and your arms ached. They didn't tell you this when you first arrived. No one warned you. You just woke up one morning, and an older servant tossed you a cloth and said, "Don't spill Lord Edmund's, he had trout last night." That's how you found out. Trial by bile. The pots themselves came in all shapes: porcelain, pewter, clay. The fancy ones had lids. The really fancy ones had engraved lids, as if that helped. They were still full of noble waste, and it was still your job to make it disappear like a magician performing the worst sleight of hand imaginable. And it didn't stop there. You didn't just carry the pot, you had to empty it. Sometimes in the privy, sometimes in the designated cesspit. Sometimes, if it was raining or late or the steward was in a mood, out the nearest window, assuming no one was passing below. Which, of course, they always were. Then came the cleaning. You didn't just dump and run. Number U scrubbed it, rinsed it, dried it. You polished the noble's excrement basin like it was the Holy Grail. Because if there was a spot, a smear, a smell, you were disrespecting the house. You weren't just cleaning a pot. You were preserving the illusion that nobles didn't stink like everyone else. Some servants tried to see the humor in it. They called it the sunrise salute. Others simply shut down. Because when you're on your knees, wiping the inside of a duke's chamber pot with a torn strip of linen, the only joke is your own life. And the nobles? They never thanked you. They barely noticed you. Until, of course, you missed a day. Then suddenly, you existed again. And not in a good way. After a day of hauling chamber pots, scrubbing pig fat out of tunics, and being screamed at because someone's socks weren't the right shade of beige, surely you get a warm bed and a moment of peace, right? No, you absolutely do not. If you were a medieval servant, your sleeping arrangement was less bedroom and more hope you find a corner that isn't already occupied by mice or someone's feet. You didn't have a room, you had a space, and even calling it that was generous. The noble family, of course, had rooms, entire suites in fact. 4 poster beds, down-stuffed mattresses, embroidered linens, and fireplaces lit before they woke up and after they fell asleep. You got the floor. Or, if you were really high-ranking, a cot in the hallway next to the laundry press, with a burlap sack for a pillow and a blanket that once doubled as a dog cover. Most servants slept wherever they could, under stairs, behind doors, in the pantry, on benches, in the stable if it was warm. You were never far from your duty. That wasn't convenience. That was control. If the Lord needed wine at midnight, someone had to be close enough to wake. That someone was usually you. And it wasn't quiet either. You might be next to the kitchen, where the coals never died and the rats threw parties. Or near the hallway, where guests stumbled through drunk at odd hours, knocking over buckets and occasionally vomiting in the wrong room. You didn't get peace. You got proximity. Privacy didn't exist. Changing clothes. You turned around and hoped no one looked. Personal belongings. You had none. If you had a bundle of clothes, you slept with them under your arms. Otherwise, they'd be gone by sunrise. Not stolen maliciously, just repurposed. Everything in a noble house was up for grabs, especially among those who owned nothing. The air was cold in winter, frigid. You huddled together with other servants like half-dead puppies. No fire, no insulation, just body heat and wool, and the ever-present smell of sweat, wood smoke, and whatever was left in your clothes from the day's labor. In summer, it was worse. The heat turned the stone walls into ovens. You couldn't breathe, couldn't sleep. You lay awake listening to others toss, turn, or quietly sob into their arms. The smell of unwashed bodies thickened the air, and lice, yes, lice, feasted in the dark like royalty at a feast. And yet you were expected to rise before the sun, cheerfully if possible, because in the noble's eyes, if you were alive enough to sleep, you were alive enough to work. So no, you didn't sleep in a bed, you curled up where the cold wasn't biting and the noise wasn't constant. You wrapped yourself in your own exhaustion and hoped morning would take its time. It never did. You might think all servants in a medieval noble house shared the same misery, and you'd be right. But just like mold grows in layers, so did the hierarchy below the nobility. There was always someone above you to blame you, and someone below you to kick when things got tense. At the top of the servant chain was the steward, the noble's right hand in all things practical. He didn't scrub floors, he didn't cook, he didn't carry water, he pointed, he made lists. He sighed with the weight of imagined nobility. And though he wasn't one of them, he definitely didn't consider himself one of you. He had nicer shoes, a room, a key ring with authority dangling from it like a threat. If something went wrong, he was the one who shouted your name first, loudly and with purpose. Below him might be the housekeeper or major domo, managing linens, stores, and who was due for punishment. She knew everything. Who stole bread, who was sneaking out, who hadn't washed the Lord's undergarments properly. Cross her, and you'd find yourself assigned to stables or chamber pot duty before the sun came up. She was feared, respected, hated, usually all three. Then came the specialists, the cook, the head groom, the butler, and so on. These people had one job and did it better than anyone. The cook, for example, ran the kitchen like a battlefield. Orders screamed, knives flying. One burned crust, and you were exiled from the bread room. The butler oversaw wine and silverware and would slap your hand if you reached for a goblet without permission. The groom knew more about horses than people, and trusted animals far more than fellow servants. Underneath these came the rest of the staff, maids, footmen, kitchen hands, laundry girls, scullions, spit boys, stable boys, the true workforce. Each had a niche, a rank, and a limit. A kitchen maid never told a laundry girl what to do. A footman might outrank a hallway sweeper but not the chambermaid. Everyone knew their place. The consequences of forgetting were swift and humiliating. And below all of that, you had the newcomers, the orphans, the punished, the forgotten. People without even titles. They floated between duties, doing the jobs no one wanted, in the places no one talked about. Cleaning vomit, chasing rats, replacing fallen servants who disappeared quietly and without ceremony. You could spend years climbing this invisible ladder. Maybe you were fast, maybe you were clever. Maybe you survived long enough to be noticed. But with every rung you climbed, you gained more responsibility and more enemies, because someone wanted your job, and someone else resented that you had it. It was a hierarchy of hunger, of need, of bruised elbows and whispered alliances. You helped others because one day you might fall, and they'd either catch you or step aside. Even in misery, people build pecking orders. It's how they survive, or pretend they're surviving. And in the noble house, pretending was sometimes all you had. There were rules in the noble house, strict, written, and unwritten. But beneath those rules, buried deep under layers of silence and shame, lived another reality. one no one spoke of during Mass or while folding linens, one every servant knew, even if they couldn't say it out loud. Because if you were young, poor, and unlucky enough to be considered attractive, then your work wasn't just physical, it was dangerous. Nobles didn't see servants as people. They were bodies, tools, fixtures. If you were quick, you were sent to fetch things. If you were quiet, you were trusted with secrets. And if you were beautiful, you became the secret. It might start small, a look, a hand brushing too long, a whispered compliment from someone who hasn't said your name in 6 months. A nobleman catches you cleaning the hearth and suddenly he's got questions about your duties. His wife's out, his drink's in hand, and the door closes behind him. No one talks about it, but everyone knows. Because in a house where the walls are thin and the staff sleep in hallways, nothing stays hidden. The smudged makeup, the sudden bruises, the look in someone's eyes when they return to the servant quarters and fold their apron more quietly than usual. There was no consent. There was only power. Nobles didn't ask, they expected. And if you resisted, you were dismissed, or accused, or transferred to some remote corner of the estate where you wouldn't embarrass anyone. But if you complied, willingly or not, you didn't get security, you got secrecy, and you carried it like a second uniform. Because one wrong word, one servant overhearing too much, one noblewoman noticing her husband's new interest, and your life shattered overnight. It wasn't just the men, either. Noble women, especially those trapped in cold marriages or isolated in long winters, found comfort where they could. A handmaid, a page, a pretty kitchen boy delivering pastries who didn't understand why she locked the door behind him. If a child was born from these arrangements, and many were, it became everyone's problem. The baby vanished, the girl disappeared, the noble's name stayed clean, and the staff said nothing, because they couldn't afford to speak. Whispers were poison in a noble house. A single rumor could destroy you. She's too close to the Baron. He's the Duchess's favorite. Did you see the way she looked at the steward? That's all it took. One whisper, and suddenly you were watched, judged, excluded, or worse, made an example of. And still, there were those who hoped, who believed a noble might fall in love, that maybe, if they were kind or clever or loyal enough, they'd be taken seriously, raised up, rescued, married even. They weren't. Because nobles didn't rescue servants, they used them, and when they were done, they acted like they'd never learned your name. You could be everywhere in a noble's house, and still, no one would ever see you. You passed through grand halls unnoticed, opened doors just before someone reached for the handle, took plates before they clattered, mopped floors before anyone realized they were dirty. You existed not to be recognized, but to erase the evidence that life was ever messy. Being a servant wasn't just about labor. It was about invisibility. You weren't supposed to be heard, smelled, or remembered. You moved through the noble's world like a shadow, silent, soft-footed, and utterly forgettable, until you made a mistake. The moment something went wrong, a wrinkle in a bedsheet, a missing glove, a sour look on the lady's face. Suddenly, everyone remembered your name. It echoed through the halls like a death sentence. Who folded this? Where's that girl? I said boiled, not baked. And just like that, you weren't invisible anymore. You were wrong. And the attention? It wasn't praise, it was scrutiny. A glare from the steward, a snide remark from the visiting cousin, an offhanded insult wrapped in a smile. At least she's quiet, if not clever. But here's the truth they never said aloud. The house didn't work without you. The nobles could host feasts, receive guests, parade in fine clothes and silk-slippered arrogance, only because someone swept the soot, stitched the hem, and lit the fires. Someone like you. You memorized patterns of movement. Who passed through which corridor when? Which floorboards creaked? How to set a cup down without a sound. You learned how to breathe through your nose to avoid smelling the worst of it. How to stand still without swaying. How to smile when spoken to and disappear when not. And you never showed emotion, not fear, not sadness, certainly not frustration. Because showing anything human was risky. It made you visible. And being visible made you vulnerable. You knew secrets. Every servant did. Affairs, debts, illnesses. You saw the noble's real face, the one not meant for public display. But you held it all like a sealed letter, because speaking was dangerous. And silence? Silence was survival. Even other servants forgot you sometimes. You worked behind them, beneath them, around them. You finished jobs no one started, cleaned messes no one saw. If you vanished tomorrow, someone would notice eventually, when the dishes piled up or the fires went out. But they wouldn't remember your face, just the absence. That was your life. Essential but expendable. Present but invisible. You were the blood pumping through the veins of the household, unseen until something bled. And still, you showed up. Every day, you worked, you watched, you endured. Not because you were weak, but because no one sees strength in the ones who suffer quietly. If you've ever watched a historical drama where every servant is dressed in crisp linen with a delicately stained apron and perfectly parted hair, forget it. That's fiction. Real servant clothes? They weren't clothes. They were surrender stitched into fabric. Your uniform was what you were given, and what you were given was what someone else no longer wanted. Maybe it was an old tunic from a steward who'd outgrown it. Maybe it was a patched-up wool shift once worn by a maid who died of fever 2 winters ago. Or maybe it was just a sack someone cut a hole in and called good enough. There was no concept of fit. If it covered your body and didn't actively fall off, you wore it. If it did fall off, you tied it back on with rope or whatever you could steal from the laundry room. Everything hung wrong. Sleeves too long, hem too short, fabric too rough. But it didn't matter. You weren't there to be admired. And clean? Ha! You wore your labor. The soot from the fireplace, the streaks from the chamber pot, the flour from the kitchen, the blood from the laundry, the wax from the candles. You washed what you could, when you could, but there was never time. And there was never a spare. The moment something tore, and it always tore, you mended it. Not later, not tomorrow. Now you learned to sew because you had to. Not dainty embroidery, not romantic cross-stitching by a window. Number U stitched sleeves while walking, hemmed skirts while kneeling, fixed collars in the dark with a rusted needle and a thread you kept hidden in your apron hem. And shoes? Luxury. Most servants had 1 pair. Worn, cracked, half a size too small. If they had laces, they were probably stolen from a bundle of kindling. If they had soles, they were probably wood. If they got wet, you worked barefoot. No one cared. Except maybe the rats, who appreciated the easier access. Nobles might parade around in gold-threaded tunics and imported silks, but your clothes told a different story. A story of bruised knees and bleeding heels, of dirt that never came out, of a back that bent and stayed bent. You wore your status on your body, and it itched. Still, you made it work. You folded the sleeves, tightened the belt, borrowed a scarf. Not for vanity, for survival. Because the cold didn't care how tired you were, and the steward wouldn't listen to complaints about chilblains. And if your apron was clean for once, that wasn't pride. That was strategy. Someone might actually mistake you for new. You woke up hungry, you worked hungry, and you went to bed hungry. That was the rhythm. Hunger was constant. a second heartbeat that never quieted, no matter how much bread crust you gnawed on in the dark. You worked in houses where tables groaned under the weight of roasted boar, honey-glazed fowl, wheels of cheese, trenchers swimming in gravy, and desserts stacked like altars. But you didn't eat that. You watched it, carried it, smelled it, sometimes licked your fingers when no one was looking. But eat it. That was for them. Servants ate after. Always after. After the nobles were full. After the plates were cleared. After the food had cooled and congealed into a kind of sad, jelly-like memory of flavor. You lined up in the kitchen, eyes low, waiting for someone to nod at the scraps. A heel of bread here, a strip of meat fat there, a spoonful of stew with half a turnip still floating in it. If you were lucky, the cook didn't owe you anything. If she liked you, maybe you got an extra ladle. If she hated you, and she usually did, you got broth so thin you could see through it. Or worse, the bottom of the pot. Burned, bitter, scraped together and handed over with a look that said, "Be grateful. It's still warm. Meals weren't served, they were scavenged. You ate standing, crouched, hiding, whatever it took. You ate fast, not because you were in a rush, but because the others were, because the food might disappear, because someone might steal it from your bowl, because the steward might walk in and decide the scullery wasn't clean enough to deserve supper, and forget utensils. You used your fingers, the edge of a crust, sometimes a spoon if you hadn't lost it again. Napkins were for nobles. Servants wiped their mouths on sleeves, their hands on aprons, and then got back to work. There were good days, feast days, holidays, times when so much food was made that even the servants ate like kings. For 10 minutes, roast meat, cheese, dried fruit. You never felt more alive, and never more aware that it wouldn't last, because the next day it was back to watery porridge and bread so hard you had to soak it in spit just to chew. And drink? Water if the well was clean. Ale if someone was generous. Wine? Not a chance. Not unless someone spilled it, and you happened to be there with a cloth, and a mouth fast enough to swipe a taste. You didn't eat to feel full. You ate to not fall over, to not faint while lifting a platter or scrubbing the hearth. Food wasn't joy, it was fuel. It was another thing you fought for, quietly, every day, and when there was nothing left, you pretended the hunger was just part of the job. You weren't just discouraged from getting sick, you were forbidden. Illness was considered a flaw, a weakness, a form of defiance. To be sick was to insult the order of the noble house. And when a servant got sick, the house didn't pause, you did. Everyone else moved on, stepped over you, reassigned your tasks, and whispered behind your back, "She's not strong enough." There were no sick days, no soft beds with warm broth and someone checking your forehead. If you had a fever, you were expected to work through it. If you vomited in a bucket, the first question wasn't, "Are you all right?" It was, "Did you finish sweeping the hall?" A limp, wrap it. A cough, swallow it. A rash, cover it. A wound, tie a rag around it and keep moving. Blood loss didn't excuse you from your duties unless it made you collapse, and even then, someone would roll you to the side and say, "Clean that up before she wakes." And if your illness was contagious, even worse, you were now a liability, not a human being, a problem that could threaten the household. The steward might quarantine you, not in a room, but in the woodshed, or a drafty cellar, or the laundry yard with nothing but a crust of bread and the sound of your own wheezing for company. Most of the time, the other servants couldn't help, not because they didn't care, because they couldn't afford to. Sharing food? Risky. Offering to do your work? Dangerous. Speaking up? Unthinkable. Sympathy could be punished, and no one wanted to be next. Healers were rare. Real medicine was for nobles. If they called someone in to look at you, it was because they didn't want you dying in the house. You were tended to just enough to ensure you didn't expire in the hallway and stain the rugs. If you died, and many did, your belongings, such as they were redistributed before your body went cold. Someone else got your sleeping spot. Someone else wore your patched apron. You became another name not spoken aloud, another warning. And if you recovered, no welcome back, no warmth. You were behind on work, and the steward had a list. You'd better be twice as fast and half as visible, because now you were the sick one. Unreliable. Soft. It taught you a lesson fast. Your body wasn't yours. It was a tool. And if the tool broke, the master simply found another. So you learned to hide your pain, to push through fever, shivers, aches, to lie when your teeth chattered and your stomach twisted, to smile when your vision blurred. Because the moment they knew you were sick was the moment they started wondering if they needed you at all. You knew where you stood the moment the Baron's dog got a cushion, and you didn't. Noble pets weren't just animals. They were statements, accessories, proof that someone in the house got affection, indulgence, and decent meals. It just wasn't you. Take the greyhound. Slender, pampered, sleeping on velvet by the hearth. Fed twice daily with scraps before the servants ate, sometimes by hand. A gooseneck here, a honeyed fig there, fresh water in a polished bowl with the family crest etched into the rim. Meanwhile, you stood 5 feet away with dirt on your face and yesterday's stew soaking through your apron, waiting for permission to breathe. Or the falcon, kept in the solar, tethered to its gilded perch, fed raw quail and brushed by a specialist who hadn't been yelled at in weeks. It got its own glove. You shared towels with the other kitchen hands and prayed no one had lice. Cats? Oh, they were divine. Lady Annalise's prized mouser had a name, a ribbon, and better manners than half the visiting nobility. Once she had a fever, and the entire household went silent. You? You had a fever last week. They told you to mop faster and not die on the rugs. The horses ate oats soaked in beer. You ate crusts soaked in hope. They had blankets. You had sleeves. They got groomed daily. You brushed your hair with your fingers if you had a moment, which you didn't. And heaven forbid anything happened to one of the animals. The whole estate went into mourning if the dog got sick. The steward might summon a vet, a priest, a potion brewer from 3 towns away. If you got sick, a shrug, a whisper, a shovel if necessary. But it wasn't just about food or comfort, it was about attention. Noble pets were touched, praised, photographed in tapestries. You were background noise. If a noble bent to pet the dog, you held your breath, not out of jealousy, but because if it snapped, you'd be blamed. Some pets were vicious, and no one cared. A servant once lost 2 fingers to a baron's hunting hound. The dog got a scolding. The servant got a shorter shift and fewer jobs, because now she couldn't hold a broom properly. You swept around their beds, cleaned up their droppings, carried them across puddles, bowed when they passed. You, a human being with bones and blood, bowing to a spaniel in a pearl-studded collar. And if you complained? If you said, "Why does the dog eat before me?" They laughed, or stared, or whispered that you were being difficult, that you didn't understand your station. Oh, you understood. Perfectly. The dog belonged to the family. You were just passing through. When festival day came to the village, people danced. Ale flowed. Banners snapped in the wind. Minstrels sang songs that rhymed just enough to sound like joy. And if you were a peasant or a merchant, it was a day to forget how hard the world had been, at least until sunrise. But if you were a servant in a noble's house, it was the worst day of the year. Because on festivals everyone partied, which meant you worked twice as hard to make it look effortless. Feast day, That meant 5 meals instead of 3, 30 guests instead of 6, trays bigger than your torso, fires roaring in every hearth, floors scrubbed until they reflected torchlight, hallways swept, tapestries straightened, beds made, beds remade, candles lit, relit, replaced, and then cleaned again when wax dripped on the silver. You woke before dawn to slaughter poultry, and stayed up past midnight cleaning up after someone's nephew who vomited roasted duck and cider all over the bishop's favorite cushion. Happy feast day. You ran between the kitchen and the hall so many times your legs went numb. Your hands blistered from polishing pewter. Your knees were raw from scrubbing stairs because apparently nothing says reverence like spotless steps for noble boots to desecrate. Music echoed through the halls. You didn't dance. You carried trays past spinning nobles and their flushed, oblivious faces. If you paused too long near the music, someone barked your name, or worse, snapped their fingers. And drunk nobles? A nightmare wrapped in velvet. Suddenly, they wanted things. More wine, more stew, their cousin's hat, a different chair. You, perhaps, not to serve, but to entertain. You learned fast to avoid eye contact, and to dodge wandering hands and slurred compliments that ended with, "Tell no one, eh?" Some of the other servants, the new ones, tried to smile through it. "It's not so bad," they'd whisper. "There's extra food." But you'd seen how it really worked. Yes, there was more food, but you didn't get it. You served it, watched it, cleaned it after it was ground into the stone floor and used to bribe dogs. And when the music stopped, when the guests stumbled to their beds and the last candle flickered out, you didn't rest. You cleared the wreckage. Bones, bottles, torn cloth, cracked goblets, someone's shoe, a ribbon left behind like a crime scene detail. You swept, scrubbed, hauled waste to the edge of the property. Then you reset the house for mourning, because the noble family didn't care that it had been a holiday. To them, the sun would rise on the same standards. Clean floors, warm water, quiet obedience. There was no feast day for you, only more of the same. Louder, heavier, and more likely to result in something broken, usually you. Words in a noble house had power. Not truth, words, whispers, side glances. An unfinished sentence dropped in the corridor and picked up by the wrong set of ears. If you were a servant, gossip wasn't just noise in the background. It was a storm waiting to strike your name. You learned this quickly. Maybe on your first day when someone leaned close and muttered, "Don't ever be alone with the steward," or the last girl who spilled wine, gone before supper. It never sounded dramatic, just quiet, heavy, carried like a splinter under the skin. At first, you thought gossip was harmless, a way to pass time while peeling potatoes or folding linens. You'd hear about who the Lord was meeting in the orchard after dusk, which noble guest wore armor at night for protection, which chambermaid was getting extra favors, whatever that meant. But then one morning, that chambermaid didn't show up for chores, and no one spoke her name again. That's when you understood. Gossip in a noble house was a weapon, one that could be aimed at you. All it took was a sentence. "I heard she was in the ladies' room after dark." That was it. Now, the lady's jewels go missing, and you're the suspect. You didn't see them. You didn't even know she had a pearl comb. But now, your name is in the air, and you can't pull it back. It wasn't just what you said, it was what others thought you said. Stand too close to a noble's door. Be seen whispering to the cook. Laugh too loudly in the laundry room. Now you're talking. Now you know something. And someone is watching. And the nobles? They fed on it. Gossip entertained them. It gave them something to smirk about over venison and mulled wine. But when that gossip turned sour, when it threatened dignity, decorum, or family secrets, they didn't take chances. They took action. You could be demoted for gossip, punished, reassigned to stable duty or latrine cleaning. Or worse, accused of seduction, theft, betrayal, even if it wasn't true, especially if it wasn't true, because lies were easier to control than truth. And among servants, gossip wasn't much safer. It was currency, power, protection. Some servants traded secrets to curry favor, to climb the invisible ladder, to remove rivals. One whispered word could keep you from a good assignment, or win you a better one at someone else's expense. Eventually, you learned the rules. Never repeat what you hear. Never speak of what you see. Never write anything down. And above all, never react. Show surprise, and they know you heard it. Show fear, and they think it's about you. You became stone, eyes down, ears closed, a sealed mouth in a house full of tongues. But the truth was, gossip could save you, if you listened carefully. It was how you avoided disaster, knew who to stay away from, who to obey, who was falling from favor, and who was about to rise. You learned to hear everything and say nothing. Because in a noble house, secrets didn't stay secret, but servants were expected to. There was no such thing as a quiet punishment in a noble house. If you made a mistake, or worse, were accused of one, you didn't just suffer. You performed your suffering. For everyone, publicly, loudly. As a reminder to the rest of the staff that obedience wasn't a request. It was a rule carved into the stone of the estate itself. And punishments weren't rare. They were woven into the fabric of daily life, just like mopping floors or fetching kindling. You saw them all the time, not just when someone failed catastrophically, but for minor infractions. Dropped a plate? Punishment. Overslept by a minute? Punishment. Looked a noble in the eye when they were in a mood? Absolutely punishment. It started with the most common tool, humiliation. That could be as simple as being made to kneel in the center of the great hall for hours, hands behind your back, while guests stepped around you like you were a misplaced rug. Or being made to wear a shame token, a wooden sign tied around your neck that read, lazy or thief. Spelled wrong, of course, because the steward wasn't exactly a scholar. If they wanted to escalate, there was the stocks, a medieval classic. You'd be locked in, arms and head trapped, left outside in the cold, the rain, or the blistering sun while townsfolk and even the younger nobles hurled insults or kitchen scraps. You'd hear the laughter echoing from the windows. Sometimes from your fellow servants, too. Not because they enjoyed it, but because they were relieved it wasn't them. Then came beatings. Administered with a rod, a stick, a belt, or in some cases, poetic irony, a broom handle. The location varied. Sometimes it happened behind closed doors. Other times, right in front of the staff to make an example. The steward would speak solemnly before striking, as if punishing someone made him holy. He'd talk about discipline, duty, the honor of the house, all while your back turned into a map of fresh bruises. You couldn't cry out. That was weakness. You couldn't collapse. That was failure. You stood as tall as you could, endured, and hoped the lord or lady wasn't feeling extra theatrical that day. Because if they were, they'd add their own flair. A cold slap, a sharp insult, a symbolic gesture like tearing your apron or throwing your tools into the fire. And sometimes it got worse. If the accusation was serious, theft, lying, disobedience of character, you could be dismissed. Not formally, just told to leave, with no food, no shoes, no reference, no coin. If you were lucky, you made it to the next village before nightfall. If not, you disappeared. The house went on, the servants whispered, your name faded. And for the worst crimes? Crimes involving noble pride, dignity, or scandal? They called the guards. And the gallows weren't far. In a medieval noble house, punishment didn't just come from the steward, the lord, or the lady. It came from God, or at least that's what they told you. And you believed it. Because from the moment you were old enough to scrub a floor, you were taught one thing. Your suffering was divine design. You weren't poor because of bad luck. You weren't a servant because your parents lost everything in a drought. No, you were born into this because the heavens wanted it that way. That's what the priest said anyway, week after week. The meek shall inherit the earth, he'd preach, standing in robes that cost more than a year of your labor. Blessed are those who serve humbly, for they serve the Lord. And you listened, you bowed your head, you prayed. Not for escape, but for strength to carry the next tray without spilling. For the courage to face the noblemen who watched you too closely. For forgiveness when your body ached too much to kneel properly during morning mass. The chapel was beautiful. Stained glass, polished pews, incense thick in the air. But you never sat in the front. You didn't sit at all. Servants stood in the back, still, silent, heads down. You prayed for your masters, for the health of their children, for victory in their battles. No one prayed for you. Religion in the noble house wasn't a comfort. It was a leash. It taught you your place and dared you to question it. To serve is holy. Work is worship. To complain is to sin. That's what they told you while they dined on veal and you washed blood from the kitchen tiles. Confession wasn't relief, it was surveillance. You told the priest everything. Your envy, your fatigue, your silent hatred. And then he nodded, said a few words in Latin, and told you to be grateful. God sees all, God forgives, but God doesn't promote you out of the scullery. And penance? Oh, it wasn't just for sin, it was for thoughts. Thought about resting, thought about running, thought about that noble's smug face and what you'd do if you ever had a knife and no witnesses. You confessed those too, just in case. Some believed deeply, truly. They wore crosses made of straw, whispered psalms while they worked, believed that heaven was watching and would remember their suffering. That paradise would feel like a warm bed and soft bread and silence. That all of this pain was just a test. Others, well, they still went to chapel, but their prayers were quieter, colder, less like hope and more like bargaining. Just let me make it through this week. Don't let him notice me tonight. Please, just one day without blood. You couldn't skip Mass. Not unless you were dying. Even then, the steward might still drag you by the collar and prop you against the back wall. Because God needed to see you suffer, and the nobles needed to see you obey. You didn't just work for the house, you worked for heaven's approval, and you never felt like you earned it. If you were a servant in a medieval noble house, the idea of a love life was about as realistic as clean floors that stayed clean or nobles who thanked you. Love wasn't forbidden. It was inconvenient. And anything inconvenient in a noble household was treated like a disease, quietly, cautiously, and usually with punishment. It started with proximity. You lived shoulder to shoulder with other servants. You shared chores, meals, sleeping spaces. You saw each other at your worst, covered in soot, bleeding from your hands, crying quietly behind the door of the laundry room. And yes, sometimes feelings formed. Sometimes you shared stolen moments behind a stack of firewood, a shared hunk of bread, a whispered joke when the hall was silent. But the noble house didn't make room for romance. There was no privacy. You couldn't go for a walk. Couldn't hold hands in public. couldn't linger too long in a hallway without someone accusing you of neglecting your duties or, worse, conducting inappropriate behavior. If you were caught, and you always were eventually, it didn't matter if it was love or lust or simply loneliness. It was a distraction. One of you would be reassigned, sent to the other wing, given triple duties or dismissed. Nobles didn't like their staff forming bonds. It made people harder to control. And relationships between servants? Dangerous, but still possible. Relationships between a servant and a noble? Disastrous. If a nobleman showed interest in a maid, it wasn't romantic. It was predatory. You couldn't say no, you could only try to survive. If it turned into something more, a pregnancy, a rumor, a public confrontation, you were the one who paid the price. Dismissed, disgraced, forgotten. He stayed in his seat at the head of the table. You vanished. And if a servant girl thought a noble might love her, if she dreamed, even for a second, that he would raise her up, marry her, make her life better, the other servants would look at her with pity, because they'd seen it before. Always the same ending. A girl alone, a child without a name, a legacy of silence. Even among servants, love was fragile. Jealousy festered fast. If someone else fancied the same stable hand, rumors would spread. She's loose. He's a liar. They meet at night in the chapel. Words that started fights, broke hearts, ended futures. Marriage? Only if the steward approved, only if it didn't interfere with your hours, only if the noble family didn't think it was inappropriate, which, conveniently, it always was. So you learned to tuck your feelings behind your apron string, to love in silence, to express affection with a nod, a crust of bread, a bandaged cut. You memorized their footsteps, shared glances instead of kisses. And if you were lucky, if you were very lucky, you found someone willing to bear the burden with you. Not a fairy tale, not a poem, but something warm in the cold, if only for a while. In a noble house, everything was measured by class, your food, your bed, your work, your future. But when the plague came, none of that mattered. The plague didn't care if you were a chambermaid or a duchess. It killed without manners. It started with a rumor, a villager coughing blood 2 towns over, a priest refusing to touch the dead. Then someone in the manor started shivering. Fever, buboes, vomit. Suddenly, the whispers weren't rumors anymore. They were warnings. Nobles panicked. They locked themselves in private wings, burned herbs in every room, hung garlic from door frames. Some even fled. Entire households packed up and vanished overnight, leaving the servants behind. To them, you weren't worth bringing. You were already too exposed, too replaceable. The servants, though, you stayed, not by choice. You were told to keep working, even when people started dying. First the scullion, then the cook, then the stable hand, then someone in the laundry fell mid-fold, coughing black blood onto the fresh linen. You weren't allowed to stop. You were only told to wear a cloth over your mouth. Don't touch the corpse. Boil the sheets. They said God would protect the faithful. So the priests came, swinging incense, chanting prayers. But they died too, faster than most. Soon the manor began to stink. Death crept under every door. Some nobles insisted their staff wash twice a day in vinegar. Others simply stopped leaving their chambers. Meals were left outside the door. Chamber pots weren't emptied. Fires went out in the hearths because no one was brave enough to climb the stairs anymore. When the grave pits filled, the servants dug more. The steward kept a ledger, names scratched off one by one. Some entries were replaced with just a mark, an X, or nothing at all. No one cried. There was no time for mourning. You took the dead by the legs and dragged them to the yard. You wrapped them in bed sheets, clean if you had any. You stacked them behind the stables and waited for the cart. And if the cart didn't come, you buried them yourself. No prayers, no stones, just silence and shallow earth. You didn't talk about it, not while it was happening, not after, because talking made it real, and real meant you were next. When the worst passed, and the survivors crawled from the wreckage of their routine, everything was quieter, fewer footsteps, fewer meals, fewer names whispered in the halls. The noble house survived. Mostly, so did some of the nobles, and some of the servants. But not all, not even most, just enough to clean up the mess. The steward gave a speech. He called it God's judgment. Promised things would return to normal, but they didn't. Because now you knew, no matter how low you stood in the hierarchy, death didn't look up when it arrived, it just knocked. And if no one answered, it walked in anyway. In a medieval noble house, fire was everywhere. In the hearth, in the kitchen, in the torches lining the halls. It warmed the nobles' bath, cooked their meals, lit their feasts, and burned their enemies in effigy. It was necessary, revered, and it was your job to control it. No pressure. If the fire died in the ladies' chamber, you'd be called lazy. If it flared too high in the kitchen and scorched the roast, you were incompetent. But if it got loose, if one spark landed where it shouldn't, you weren't just in trouble. You were in danger, because in these stone castles and timber halls, one wrong ember could end it all. It started small, always. A candle left too close to a curtain. A torch bracket cracked with age. A pot of goose fat boiling over while the cook screamed at the scullions. You turned your back for 1 second. One, and then it happened. Smoke. Sparks. That sickening moment where everyone stops, realizing the glow in the corner isn't supposed to be there. Then came the panic. Water was nowhere. Buckets were never filled fast enough. You ran to the well, ran back, sloshed half the bucket down your leg. Flames licked the walls, swallowed the rafters. The nobles screamed, the servants shouted. The steward pointed wildly and contributed nothing useful, as always. The fire didn't care who you were. It ate linens, furniture, banners, candles, tapestries. It climbed stairs like a beast and curled into beds like a ghost. Smoke filled the halls, turning everything into a choking maze. You'd practiced for this, in theory, bucket lines, orders, priorities. Save the Lord's ledgers. Protect the chapel relics, rescue the wine casks. But in the moment, training fled. Instinct took over. You grabbed what you could, dragged people, slapped flames with wet rags, lost shoes, lost breath, lost time. And still the nobles yelled, "Save my dog! Where is my ring box? Put out the library!" You risked your life to protect their cushions. They risked nothing. When the fire finally died, smothered, starved, or surrendered, the air was thick with ash and accusation. Who left the door open? Who spilled the oil? Who forgot to douse the coals? The noble's favorite chair was gone. Someone had to pay. It didn't matter that you fought the flames with blistered hands and bleeding feet. If you had soot on your face, they looked at you. Sometimes it wasn't even your fault. Sometimes it was lightning, or a chimney crack, or a child with a candle playing pretend. But they'd still find a scapegoat. Someone to blame, someone to dismiss, someone like you. And the next day, the nobles discussed repairs. The steward drafted lists. A new tapestry was ordered from the city. But no one remembered the servant who ran back in to pull the crying maid from the cellar. No one remembered the boy who didn't come out at all. Cold in a noble house wasn't just uncomfortable, it was weaponized. The stones froze from the inside. Your breath fogged the air inside the kitchen. You could light every hearth in the building, and still There'd be rooms where frost gathered on the walls like some quiet reminder. You do not belong here. The nobles had fur, fireplaces, wine warmed with spice and honey. They had wool layered beneath silk, thick carpets, feather bedding, dogs curled at their feet. If a draft bothered them, a servant was summoned to find it, block it, fight it, if necessary. You, on the other hand, shivered your way through the season in a tunic with holes in shoes that hadn't felt dry since the harvest. Your bed, a straw mat next to a leaking window, was frozen every morning. You started your day by breaking the ice off the water buckets inside the hall. Winter meant more fires to tend, more boots to clean, more cloaks to fetch and dry. You worked while your fingers went numb. You slipped on stone stairs dusted with frost. You coughed and wheezed through the day because the cold didn't just hurt, it invaded, deep, quiet, slow. There was no sympathy if you stumbled. Be careful if you sneezed. Don't bring sickness into the house. If your hands were too stiff to grip the tray and it fell, you were scolded, maybe even struck. The noble didn't ask if you were freezing. They asked why their cup was chipped. Laundry was the worst. Scrubbing garments in water so cold it cut your skin. You washed sheets with your sleeves rolled to the elbow and cried because you couldn't feel your arms. The soap barely foamed. The fabric froze stiff before it dried. You hammered it against the wall just to fold it. And still, you worked, wrapped in every rag you could find, huddled by the kitchen hearth for moments at a time. You shared body heat with the other servants, not because it was romantic, but because it was survival. You watched nobles walk through the courtyard in fur-lined cloaks that trailed behind them like banners. You didn't envy the luxury, you envied the warmth. Snow brought more work, clearing paths, salting steps, chopping wood until your hands bled. If the gates froze shut, you were the one sent to hammer them open. If the barn door stuck, you braced your back and pushed, breath catching in your chest like splinters. And all the while, the cold crept under every door, into your bones, your lungs, your memory. Winter didn't just pass, it settled. And you endured. Because servants couldn't fall sick, couldn't freeze, couldn't fail. They could only survive, quietly, invisibly, just like the frost. If winter in a noble house tried to freeze you into submission, summer tried to cook you alive. You'd think stone walls would keep the place cool. That's what outsiders assumed. But walk into a medieval kitchen in August, with 5 fires blazing, 3 ovens stuffed with meat, and a boiling cauldron of broth that never stops bubbling, and you'll find hell didn't wait for the afterlife. It lived behind the spice rack. You woke sweating. Not because the sun was up, it wasn't yet, but because your sleeping space had no windows, no breeze, and 6 other servants breathing in the same musty, oven-like crawl space. The air was thick before dawn. By midday, it was unbreathable. The nobility didn't notice. They sipped chilled wine. They sat in shaded courtyards and fanned themselves with silk, while servants stood nearby with cloths, just in case their lord broke a sweat and needed it wiped by someone else. They moved slowly, complained about the heat, ordered baths, which you hauled water for, and scented oils, which you applied. You? You didn't stop moving long enough to notice how tired you were. You ran errands across the sun-soaked courtyard, hauled buckets, moved trays, spent hours in the stables, shoveling manure so pungent the flies formed full-scale armies. And when the nobles asked for cold wine from the cellar, you were the one running into the depths and back again, gasping like a dying hound by the time you returned. There was no bathing for you, not daily, not even weekly sometimes. You wiped your face with your sleeve, splashed your hands at the basin outside the kitchen. If you were lucky, the cook let you stand near the wash barrel after supper, but full body washing, that was reserved for the lady's poodle. You reeked. Everyone did. It wasn't your fault. You wore the same clothes for days, patched and sweat-soaked, until they could stand on their own. Your feet blistered, your back ached, your hair clung to your neck like wet rope. And yet, you were expected to serve gracefully, bow, smile, carry trays with precision, all while pretending you weren't melting from the inside out. And the insects? Endless. Flies, gnats, fleas, biting, buzzing, crawling. You swatted at your face constantly, which earned you a scolding from the steward. Stop fidgeting, you look twitchy. You wanted to scream, "I'm being eaten alive," but instead you nodded and stood still. Like bait. Festivals in summer were worse. More food, more drink, more guests, which meant more work. You ran until your shoes fell apart. You fainted behind the pantry door and got smacked awake because you looked lazy. And when the sun finally went down, the heat didn't, it lingered. You lay in your straw bed, sticking to the linen, wishing for winter. And that's how you knew it was bad. You were praying for frost after 6 months of shivering. Summer didn't bless you. It blistered you. You'd think that people who lived in stone castles, wore embroidered cloaks, and had entire rooms just for sitting, would act with grace and dignity. But no. Nobles didn't just misbehave, they excelled at it. And if you were a servant, you didn't just witness it. You cleaned it up, carried it, and sometimes got punished for causing it even when you didn't. They had tempers like spoiled children with swords. One bad letter, one overcooked egg, one comment from a rival lord about the color of their hose, and that was it. Tables flipped, goblets thrown. Servants screamed at for standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, or for breathing too loud. You learned the signs early. A clenched jaw meant the lady was about to throw her mirror. A tight grip on the goblet meant the lord was about to shout at his steward and then demand you find a missing wine that never existed. Sometimes they took it out on the furniture. Sometimes they took it out on each other. And sometimes they took it out on you, because nobles didn't believe in consequences, not for themselves. If the lady dropped her ring and accused the maid of stealing it, you got searched. If the baron tripped over his dog, you were scolded for leaving the floor uneven. If their son insulted a visiting knight, and that knight stormed out in a rage, you were blamed for not refilling the wine fast enough to calm everyone down. They drank a lot. Wine at breakfast, ale at lunch, mead at supper. And once drunk, they became someone else, a worse someone. Louder, more dangerous, more prone to pointing at a servant and saying, "Bring her," or "Remove him," or "Why is that still here?" It wasn't always anger. Sometimes it was games, cruel ones. Let's see if she can balance the tray with one hand and a book on her head. Let's wager whether the footman can outrun the dog. You played along because if you didn't, they'd say you were dull or disobedient, and disobedience in a noble's house was a sin worth punishing. They cheated at chess, lied during confession, mocked poor guests behind their backs, then welcomed them with fake smiles. They spent money like it grew on the trees they'd already taxed into oblivion. And when it ran out, they cut servant wages or sold your sleeping quarters to the apothecary. And when nobles fought with each other, it was Cold War behind curtains. Entire days passed with no one speaking above a whisper. You were sent to deliver notes with no eye contact. You waited outside closed doors and tried not to flinch at the sounds. Eventually, someone emerged, red-eyed or red-faced, and things went on, until the next feud. You weren't just a servant. You were a witness. To cruelty, carelessness, lust, rage, and insecurity dressed in velvet. And every time you saw it, you told yourself, remember. Remember who they really are, because you might not have power, but you knew, somewhere in the back of every servant's mind, in between the scrubbing and fetching and trying not to cry while polishing the same goblet for the 5th time, there was a fantasy, a rebellion, a glorious moment when the servants would rise up, flip the long table, and dump the Lord's roast pheasant into his powdered lap. You imagined it sometimes. Quietly. A plate, accidentally, dropped into a noble's lap. A chair leg mysteriously loose. The wine watered down just enough to taste like swamp. Not treason, just tiny acts of resistance. Small rebellions, like crumbs under the velvet rug. But let's be real, it never went anywhere. Not because you didn't want it to, because if you tried, you'd die, swiftly, publicly, and probably with a sign around your neck that said something like bad example or disruptive element. The house wasn't just filled with nobles. It was built for them. Every hallway, every corridor, every watchful eye existed to keep you small. You were outnumbered, outarmed, and worst of all, everyone was terrified. Even the steward, even the head cook. Nobody wanted to be the one standing when the axe fell. There was no union, no whisper network of revolutionaries hiding behind the stables. At best, there were a few older servants who grumbled a little louder than they should. And even they knew better. You might grumble in the pantry, but when the bell rang, you bowed and ran. Still, there were little moments. The cook might give the noble's least favorite pie a little extra salt. The laundry maid might accidentally starch the wrong blouse so stiff it stood up on its own. The groom might swap 2 horses, just to hear the baron shout at the wrong one. These were victories. Petty, invisible, incredibly satisfying victories. You clung to them like relics. The real rebellion? It was silence. The long, unbroken endurance of people who knew how to disappear into their work, say nothing, and remember everything. Because you couldn't fight, but you could observe. And one day the noble might slip. Not by your hand, but by their own. And if they did, you'd remember. You'd be there, broom in hand, eyes cast downward. And deep inside you'd think, I saw this coming. I always did. But then you'd clean it up. Because that's what you were paid to do, when you were paid at all. There was no uprising, no storming of the drawing room with torches and trays, just survival, service, and a shared glance between 2 tired servants who both knew. If rebellion ever came, it wouldn't start here. Not because we're weak, because we're watched. There were no promotions in a medieval noble house, only survival upgrades. You didn't climb a ladder. You crawled up it, missing a few rungs, bleeding from the shins, hoping that at the top you'd find something better than cold floors and verbal abuse. Spoiler, you didn't. Let's say you started at the bottom, a scullion, scrubbing pots so blackened they absorbed light. You kept your head down, you learned when to speak, never, how to move, quietly, and how to scrub without breathing too loudly. You didn't complain, you didn't faint, you didn't drop anything that belonged to someone who had a title. Eventually, someone noticed. Not the nobles, of course, but maybe the cook or the steward. And one day, the phrase changed from, "Hey you," to, "Get me Thomas." And now you had a name again. You were moved from scullery to kitchen help, from sweeping hallways to cleaning chambers, from chambermaid to undermaid, and just like that you were promoted by medieval standards. You now had twice the responsibility, the same pay, none, and a new target on your back, because every other servant now saw you as a threat. Because in a servant's world, anyone with authority was authority, and now it was your job to relay orders, to make sure things got done. And if they didn't, Guess who the steward shouted at? Not the noble's niece who spilled wine all over the tapestry. You. Maybe you rose far enough to become a butler or housekeeper, lofty titles that came with keys, ledgers, and ulcers. You had to manage chaos without ever being chaotic. You became the filter between noble tantrums and servant breakdowns. You had to know everything. Who was sick, who was sneaking bread, who might quit, and how to keep it all from exploding during dinner service. You got your own room, barely larger than a broom closet. You got your own key, which you never stopped checking because if it went missing, so did you. You got respect, thin, grudging, and only when things ran perfectly. And they never ran perfectly. You no longer scrubbed floors, but you had to answer for every one that was dirty. You didn't chop vegetables, but you had to explain why the stew tasted like regret. You didn't change linens, but you personally inspected everyone for stains, creases, or wrinkles in the fabric or the truth. And what did you get in return? Not riches, not safety, just a slightly warmer blanket. Maybe first pick of leftover bread. Maybe the cook didn't shout at you today. The truth was, moving up didn't mean escape. It just meant you were one rung higher on the gallows. And when something went wrong, when it always went wrong, the fall hurt a lot more from the top. There was no retirement for a servant, no pension, no farewell banquet with stale cake and forced applause. You didn't grow old in peace, you just grew old, slowly, painfully. And then one day, you didn't wake up. Or worse, you did, and still had to carry a bucket. Because in a noble house, you worked until your body gave out. And even then, someone might nudge you with a boot and say, "You still have one good arm." The only rest you got was the kind no one came back from. You could tell who was close. The ones who moved slower, who winced more, who slept too deeply on straw and got up with groans that sounded like floorboards cracking. Some lost their hearing, some lost fingers. Some lost memories, not because of age, but because they'd been working in smoke, poison, and freezing water since they were children. They weren't honored, they were resented. An old servant was a reminder of what happened if you stayed too long. A burden. A story that no one wanted to hear again. The steward sighed when he saw them. The younger servants whispered. The nobles didn't even realize the person bringing them their soup had once been the one who dressed their father. Sometimes they were given lighter work, feeding the chickens, peeling root vegetables, but more often they were kept on the same tasks until their legs failed. And when they collapsed mid-duty, it wasn't tragedy, it was inconvenient. Someone else had to pick up the bucket. There were no graves with names. If you were lucky, you were buried outside the wall with the others. If you weren't, they put your body in the forest for the birds, a quiet, efficient disposal. You didn't get a priest, you didn't get a stone, you got forgotten. And the house moved on, fast. Another body in the uniform, another pair of hands. The new scullion didn't know your name, didn't care, just knew the bucket had to be moved. The chamber had to be cleaned. Life went on, work never stopped. There were stories, though, whispers. That was old Merrick's spot. She died right there by the well. They'd say it in passing, not with reverence, but as a warning. Keep moving, or you'll end up like her. The older you got, the quieter you became. Not just because you were tired, but because you knew no one wanted to hear you. You'd seen too much. Knew where the bodies were buried, sometimes literally. That kind of knowledge made people uncomfortable. So you held it inside. Until the day your hand shook too much to carry the ladle. Until your knees buckled on the stairs. Until your back finally refused to bend again. And the bucket rolled out of your grip. And no one said thank you. If you thought the nobleman was cruel, or the lady was difficult, then you clearly hadn't met their children. because nothing, prepared you for the horror of serving miniature nobles with too much sugar and no consequences. They were the perfect storm, entitled like their parents, curious like children, and completely immune to rules. You couldn't discipline them, you couldn't correct them, you couldn't even look at them the wrong way without risking your job. And yet, you were expected to be their maid, tutor, nurse, entertainment, punching bag, and emotional support goat, all in one. They had moods like the weather, but worse because you couldn't predict them, and umbrellas weren't invented yet. One minute, they wanted a story. The next, they threw a wooden horse at your head because the story didn't have a dragon. You picked it up, handed it back, and prayed they didn't ask for an actual dragon. Because if they did, and you didn't provide one, somehow you were the disappointment. You dressed them, washed them, chased them. And they ran, always. Through halls, kitchens, out into the rain with no shoes, back in, dripping wet and laughing, while you tried to mop up the trail and stop the steward from noticing. They broke things constantly. Plates, chairs, dogs, and when they did, you were blamed. Why didn't you stop him? Why didn't you see her heading toward the tapestry with the ink pot? Why wasn't someone watching them? You wanted to say, because someone gave the 3-year-old a sword, but you didn't. You smiled, you curtsied, you picked up the broken pieces and said it was your fault. Because it always was. They played games that weren't fun for anyone else. Hide and seek that ended with someone locked in a cupboard for 6 hours. Sword play that included actual swords. Tag in the dining hall with priceless relics as obstacles. Once, a noble child tried to ride a goose like a warhorse. It didn't end well, for the goose or the servant assigned to catch it. And when they cried, it wasn't just tears, it was the arrival of guilt, shame, and fury. You were questioned, scolded. What did you do? Never what happened. Always, what did you do to upset the heir to a crumbling manor and a chest of tax records? But the worst part, the part no one said aloud, was when they were kind. When they shared a biscuit, or held your hand, or told you they didn't want you to leave. Because then, just for a second, you remembered they were children, raised in rot, fed lies, trained to command. And they were becoming just like their parents because no one ever told them not to. So you nodded, you smiled, you played along. Because deep down, you knew. They weren't just noble children. They were the next generation of your future tormentors. There were no off hours for a servant, no leisure, no me time. You didn't end your shift and go home to a warm meal and a bench by the fire with a bit of lute music in the background. When your workday ended, if it ever did, your options for recreation included collapsing, coughing, or trying to fall asleep before the next bell rang. The nobles had entertainers, minstrels, jesters, traveling acrobats. They had feasts and dancing and private plays put on by people who had actual scripts. Their boredom was a problem to be solved with gold and applause. You, on the other hand, had a different relationship with boredom. It wasn't something you fixed, it was something you earned. Boredom was rare, a luxury, a space between disasters where, just for a few minutes, nobody was shouting your name. So what did you do for fun? You watched the rats. Not metaphorically, literally. Sometimes they fought over crumbs near the bread pantry, and it was the most drama you got all week. You'd lean against the wall, your whole body aching, and whisper, "I'm rooting for the big one." Other times, you made up songs while you swept, mostly out of tune, mostly about how you hated the kitchen floor, or the steward's voice, or the fact that the goose had better shoes than you. If someone smuggled in a deck of cards, it was a treasure. You played in the dark, on the edge of your straw mat, hoping the steward wouldn't hear the flick of the cards. The stakes were never money. You didn't have any. You bet chores. shifts. Who had to get up first tomorrow? There were stories, too. Old ones passed from servant to servant. About ghosts in the East Wing. About a maid who disappeared and now whispered through the chimneys. About the Baron's uncle who fell in love with a stable boy and got turned into a stone gargoyle. You didn't believe them, not really. But in the dark, when the air was cold and your fingers numb, they felt real enough. Sometimes you talked. Quietly, whispered confessions, jokes, dreams, a recipe you remembered, a song your mother sang before she sold you to the house. Those nights, it almost felt like you belonged to something. Not the house, not the noble family, but to the others like you. That was your entertainment. No music, no dancing. Just voices in the dark, sharing what little of yourselves you had left. Because joy wasn't something handed down to you. You carved it from the silence between commands. And if you were lucky, very lucky, the mice would put on a good show. If anything went missing in a noble house, a brooch, a silver spoon, half a roasted quail, there was only one direction the suspicion ever pointed, downward. Nobles didn't steal. Nobles didn't misplace things. Nobles didn't forget that they gave their comb to their cousin's wife 3 weeks ago and now it's not where they thought it was. So when something vanished, the question wasn't what happened. It was which servant took it. And once your name was whispered, that was it. You were guilty. No hearing, no defense. No one called a magistrate. You weren't tried. You were examined. Your room was searched, your blanket overturned, your bundle of rags pulled apart in the courtyard while others watched, silently thanking the stars it wasn't them. You had no privacy, no property. So it wasn't just about finding what went missing. It was about proving a point. That even if you didn't take this thing, you'd probably take something one day. So better to scare the desire right out of you. They'd ask questions you couldn't answer. Why were you in the West Corridor? Because the steward sent me. Why were you near the ladies' chambers? Because I brought the water. Why is your apron missing? Because it fell into the fire and no one would let me replace it. Doesn't matter. You're lying, or hiding something, or just being difficult. Sometimes it wasn't even about something valuable. Once, a noble accused a maid of stealing a scrap of lace. Not a necklace, not a ring, just a torn piece of fabric. She'd used it to bind a blister on her foot. The noble lady saw it and screamed as if she'd been robbed at sword point. They said, "Return it and we won't punish you." But what if you didn't have it? What if you never touched it? Then you had two choices. Confess to a crime you didn't commit, or suffer for the lie you refused to tell. Some confessed anyway, just to make it end. They cried, begged, promised to be better. They were whipped or dismissed, or both. And the real thief, usually another noble, or the noble's guest, or even their child, was never mentioned again. You couldn't report injustice. Who would you tell? The steward? He was the one pointing the finger. The priest? He'd tell you to pray harder. The guards? They answered to the ones accusing you. So you learned to move carefully, to leave your hands in view, to speak only when spoken to. You never lingered, never stared at anything too long. If you found something lying on the floor, a button, a pin, a coin, you left it there. Even if you were starving, because one coin could cost you everything. If you were a servant in a noble's house, you didn't read, you didn't write, you didn't even sign your name. Not because you didn't want to, but because no one ever taught you how. Why would they? Literacy was dangerous. It made you curious, made you think too much, made you notice things you weren't supposed to, like debts, secrets, or that the noble lady had borrowed her cousin's jewelry again and was lying about it for the 3rd time this month. So the system made sure you stayed illiterate. on purpose. Books were locked away, literally, behind doors, behind cabinets. Only the steward, the priest, or the noble's children were allowed near them. If you dusted them, you wore gloves. If you dropped one, God help you, you'd be dismissed, whipped, or both, and heaven forbid you opened one, even by accident. If you had the nerve to ask to learn, you'd be laughed at. What would you need to read for? They'd say. Are you planning to write a cookbook, pen a poem, compose a love letter to the laundry tub? Your job was to listen, to remember, to obey, not to question, not to write anything down, not to read the orders, just to carry them out. And yet, information was everywhere, in letters, ledgers, notes pinned to pantry doors. You handled these things daily, but understood none of it. You saw your name scrawled in red ink. Next to it, a symbol, a line, a mark. You didn't know what it meant, but you felt it, a warning. Some servants learned in secret. A sympathetic tutor, a kind priest, a steward's bored son who wanted someone to impress. They'd teach you a letter or two, show you how to spell salt. You'd trace shapes in the ashes behind the oven. Practice your name with your finger in spilled flour. Forget it again when the bell rang, because there was no time, and no space for education in a life where survival was the only lesson worth learning. Servants who could read were often distrusted, called arrogant. Too clever. They were watched more closely, asked harder questions, given more tasks but no more respect. And if you made a mistake, it was, he should have known better. He can read, after all. So, most of you just kept your heads down. You memorized things, the shape of a bottle, the weight of a pouch, the color of a ribbon. You knew which scroll was for the chapel and which was for the wine cellar, not by reading it, but by the smudge in the corner, the stain from last year's feast, the way the steward rolled it too tightly when he was angry. You were sharp, just not in the way they measured. Not on paper, not in ink, but in the mind, and the memory, and the silence. Because in a house where words were hoarded like gold, your only power came from what you remembered, and you never forgot. In a medieval noble house, sleep wasn't a luxury. It was a ration, a flicker of relief you stole between shifts, meals, bells, and punishments. You didn't have a bedtime. You had a collapse time. You dreamed, when you got the chance, not of freedom or love or faraway cities. You dreamed of quiet, of warm bread, of no one calling your name. You dreamed of not being afraid to close your eyes. But most of the time, you didn't sleep long enough to dream at all. You weren't allowed to rest when tired. You rested when everything was done, and nothing was ever done. Fires needed tending at night. Chamber pots needed emptying before dawn. If the noble's child woke screaming because of a bad dream, you were summoned to sit in the corner and hum until they fell asleep again. You weren't family. You were furniture that made soft noises. Your sleeping space was wherever your body dropped. A corner, a bench, the kitchen floor. You slept curled, because if you stretched out, someone might trip over you. You slept clothed, because changing meant cold. You slept lightly, because the moment your breathing deepened, the door creaked open, and someone shouted, "Get up!" And if you were caught sleeping when you shouldn't have been, the wrath. Lazy. Disrespectful. You think you've earned a nap? One kitchen boy once dozed off against a flour sack after 3 straight days on his feet. The cook dumped a pail of cold water on him and made him scrub the scullery floor with his own tunic. There was no comfort, no pillow, just straw, often moldy, or folded cloth that smelled of everyone who'd used it before. Blankets were shared. If you were new, you got the corner of one. If you were old and useful, you got the middle. You wrapped yourself in it like a secret and prayed the night passed quickly. And the noises? Constant. Nobles arguing upstairs, rats clawing through barrels, wind whistling through broken shutters, servants groaning in their sleep, dreaming of work because it was all their minds could remember. You slept through pain, through cold, through hunger. You learned to do it because you had no choice, because without sleep your hands shook and your steps faltered, and that got noticed, and getting noticed never helped. Some nights you didn't sleep at all, festivals, emergencies, visitors, or just a bad night for the Baron's digestion, which meant someone had to hold the basin. That someone was usually you, so no, you didn't have dreams. You had flickers of unconsciousness interrupted by bells. And if, on rare nights, you managed to dream of something sweet, a bakery, a meadow, a quiet room with a fire and a bed, you woke up to the steward's voice, and the memory slipped away before your feet touched the floor. War was a nobleman's pastime, a chance to wear shiny armor, give long speeches about honor, and settle grudges with other men who also didn't do their own laundry. It was glory, banners, horses, and blood spilled far away from silk sheets. But when the nobles went to war, the servants didn't stop working. In fact, you worked more, because the house had to function whether its lord was home or galloping across a battlefield yelling about family honor. The lady stayed behind. The children, the steward, the guests, the priest who suddenly needed a lot more wine, and all of them expected nothing to change. Rooms still had to be cleaned, meals still had to be made, letters had to be delivered, horses groomed, linen pressed. The estate ran as if the world wasn't burning outside its gates, and you were the one shoveling coal into its fire. And then came the soldiers. They marched through the manor like they owned it, which, in a way, they did, or at least the Lord's seal on a scroll said so. They tracked mud through the halls, spat in the fireplace, took meat from the kitchen without asking. You were expected to feed them, wash their clothes, polish their weapons, and not say a word when they eyed you too long in the corridor. They were loud, drunk, tired, some of them barely more than boys, but still dangerous. Because if one accused you of stealing a blade or sneaking a look at a map, the steward would take their word over yours. Every time. War also meant shortages. The good food was sent to the front. The bad food was served to you. Rations were stretched thin. You learned to be grateful for boiled roots and stale bread. Even wine went missing, reserved for the commander's nerves. You didn't have nerves, apparently, just duties. Sometimes injured soldiers came back, not nobles, not knights, just men missing fingers or eyes or half their courage. They bled on the sheets, screamed in the night. You cleaned the wounds, you changed the linens. You bore witness to the consequences of all that glory. And then came the letters. The ones sealed with wax, carried by riders whose horses looked half dead from the road. When the lady received one, the manor held its breath. If the Lord had fallen, everything changed. Suddenly, the heir was in charge. Or worse, the steward. But often the Lord returned, whole or limping, victorious or humiliated, and you were expected to act as if nothing had happened, as if you hadn't scrubbed his blood from the sheets of his wounded men, as if you hadn't been cleaning around ghosts, because for the nobles war was a page in their family story. For you, it was more work, and more bodies to bury. When a knight died, they carved it into stone, his name, his title, the battle he died in, even if he fell off his horse and choked on a goose feather. He got a ceremony, a procession, a eulogy full of heroic lies. When a noblewoman passed, bells rang, mass was held, drapes drawn. Servants cried, because they had to. Her dresses were passed down, her portrait stayed on the wall. When a servant died, the house got quieter for a moment. Then someone else picked up the bucket. There were no graves with your name on them, just shallow ones, dug by your friends in the half-light of morning, before the cook noticed the soup was late and asked where you were. You were buried behind the stable, near the trees. Sometimes not at all, just burned with the waste, your ashes swept away with the soot. Nobody wrote your story. You had no last words carved into wood. No priest remembered you, no noble child cried for you. You were spoken of once, in the past tense, and then scrubbed from the day like a stain on the floor, and the house moved on. If you were lucky, one of the older servants mumbled your name a few times in the weeks that followed. Jessa used to do that. No one folded towels like Osric. But that faded too. People stopped saying your name, stopped noticing the quiet where you used to laugh, until even the floorboards forgot where you stepped. Because servants weren't meant to be remembered. You were meant to function, to vanish, to be replaced without disruption. Sometimes you left the house on foot, wrapped in your own coat, with a cough that wouldn't stop or a fever that wouldn't break. You said nothing. You told no one. You just knew the end was close, and you didn't want to die surrounded by people who'd forget your face before they changed your bedding. Sometimes you died on the job, mid-step, mid-chore. You collapsed in the hallway, breath gone, body heavy, and the steward stepped over you and said, "Get someone to clear this," as if you were a fallen candlestick. And once you were gone, your name was struck from the list, your blanket passed on, your shoes, if they weren't too worn, given to the new boy who'd just arrived from a village nobody cared about. But here's the secret. The other servants remembered you, even if they didn't say so, in glances, in silence, in the way they sat a little closer together on cold nights, as if trying to hold the shape you left behind, because you didn't go out with the noble's fanfare. You just stopped waking up. You spent your whole life serving, and not once did someone say, "Thank you," and mean it. Sure, nobles use the words. Occasionally, when guests were around, when they needed to appear gracious. "Thank you," they'd say, while not looking at you, brushing their sleeve as if your presence left a stain. You may go now. That was the real reward, dismissal, permission to vanish. Because in the noble house, gratitude was rare. Recognition was rarer. You weren't praised, you were tolerated. When you did your job right, you heard nothing. When you did it wrong, the whole hall knew. You carried trays that weighed more than your chest, balanced them with blistered hands, stepped quietly, bowed lower, moved faster, woke earlier. Also someone who never knew your name could grunt in approval and wave you away like smoke. And still, you hoped. Every once in a while, a noble might say something almost human. That will be all. Or, you've done fine. It wasn't warm, it wasn't kind, but it wasn't cruel, and that was enough to feel like sunlight in a cold room. The closest thing you had to encouragement came from other servants. A shared nod, a crust of bread, a whisper, "They're in a better mood today." You learned to read tone, posture, the way a tray was passed back without being dropped. You didn't hear "well done," you noticed when no one yelled. Once, a noble's guest, a traveler from far away, looked you in the eye and said, "Thank you." And it hit harder than you expected. You stood there for a second too long. The steward noticed. You were warned. Don't forget your place. You never did. You gave everything, every ounce of strength, every hour of your day, every year of your youth. And in return you got meager meals, blistered feet, aching bones, and the constant reminder that you existed for someone else's comfort. And yet, you kept going, because somewhere in that silence, you believed your effort mattered. Maybe not to them, but to the house, to your fellow servants, to the invisible rhythm that kept the estate standing while its owners squabbled and drank, and congratulated themselves on surviving another feast. "You may go," meant the task was done. The crisis averted, the floor cleaned, the child soothed, the Lord's boots polished to a shine he'd never see because he never looked down. It wasn't enough, but it was all you got. Walk through the manor halls and you'd see them. Nobles, painted in oil and pride, gazing down from gilded frames like they'd personally invented wheat. Each portrait told a story, even if the story was just, "Look how rich I was while doing nothing." They sat in velvet chairs, held falcons, wore armor they never fought in, surrounded by books they didn't read, dogs they didn't feed, and servants they didn't name. Even the infants had portraits. Infants, swaddled in gold-threaded blankets with expressions of royal constipation. You passed these paintings every day, pushing brooms past to their silent judgment, wondering what it would take for someone like you to be remembered in that same way. But you already knew the answer. Nothing. You could serve for 30 years, save a child from drowning, pull a noble from a fire, die cleaning up after a plague, and there still wouldn't be a frame for you. Maybe a grunt of acknowledgement. Maybe not. Your record wasn't kept in paint. It was kept in your body, in the cracks of your hands from carrying buckets, in the curve of your spine bent by laundry and duty, in the burns up your arms from kitchen fires and spilled broth, in the permanent limp from that time you slipped on a waxed stair and kept going anyway. Nobles left behind paintings. You left behind silence. Some tried to carve their names somewhere, literally. Under the stairs, in the corner of the barn, scratched into a stable post. Not for fame, not for ego, just to prove they'd been there, that they weren't a ghost in their own life. But even those marks were often scraped away, repainted, sanded down, covered with plaster, because noble houses had to appear timeless, and a servant's story had an expiration date. No one commissioned a painting of the chambermaid who raised 4 noble children better than their own mother. No artist painted the stable hand who could calm any horse. No poem was written about the cook who never lost a guest to food poisoning, despite what happened during the summer goose incident of '83. You didn't leave a legacy. You left impressions in the floorboards, a rhythm in the kitchen routines, a recipe no one remembered the source of, a quiet moment where someone said, "Who used to do this before?" And the answer came too slowly. You were not immortalized in gold leaf. You were immortalized in exhaustion. And the house? It remembered you in its own way, in the warmth of a well-stoked fire, in the polished curve of the stair railing, in the fact that it kept standing year after year, because someone, you, kept it alive. Not with a brush, but with your bare hands. Holidays in the manor looked beautiful, if you were a guest. Candles in every window, garlands on the walls, spiced wine bubbling in kettles, roasted boar wheeled in on platters as long as a coffin. Nobles laughed louder. Children shrieked higher. Even the steward smiled, which meant something was seriously wrong. But if you were a servant, holidays were a nightmare with music. The only thing special about them was how much harder you worked. More guests meant more beds to prepare, more shoes to polish, more temperamental nobles demanding hot cider, lukewarm porridge, and slippers that had been pre-warmed by a fire that you'd lit before dawn. The kitchen became a furnace. The halls echoed with footsteps that somehow all needed something right now. You ran a lot. Feast days weren't your day off, they were your test. Everything had to shine. Everything had to impress. The lady's wreath had to match the drapes. The tablecloth couldn't have a single wrinkle. The meat had to be tender enough to cut with a glance, or the cook would throw the carving knife at you or the wall, depending on her mood. And the nobles? They made speeches, toasts to God, to family, to the spirit of the season. They thanked their ancestors, their peers, sometimes even their dogs. Not once did they thank the people who actually made the celebration happen. You might get scraps, leftovers from the feast. If the guests didn't lick the platters clean first, a chunk of cheese, a slice of bread with gravy on it. Once, a servant wept because someone passed her a piece of candied pear. There were gifts exchanged, lavish ones, rings, perfumes, imported scarves. You got a nod, or maybe half a day off 2 weeks later when no one needed anything, which meant never. And the church? You went if the house did, but not to sit. You stood at the back, holding candles, coats, bags, babies, while the nobles prayed for peace, prosperity, and the strength to endure another year of absolute luxury. Some servants tried to make their own traditions. A crust shared behind the stables. A song hummed softly while polishing silver. A small token carved from scrap wood and hidden under a shared blanket. Nothing extravagant, nothing noble, but something real. The holiday wasn't yours. It never was. But sometimes, in the flicker of a shared candle, in the hush after the noise, in the brief, aching silence when the manor finally slept, you felt something like celebration. Not joy, not freedom, but the quiet dignity of surviving another year. And maybe, just maybe, you let yourself hope. Not for more. Just for a moment that didn't hurt. Laughter wasn't forbidden in the noble house, but it was monitored, measured. And if it came from the wrong mouth, yours, at the wrong time, in the wrong room, in the wrong tone, then suddenly it wasn't laughter anymore. It was disruption. Insubordination, a display of poor character. So you learned to laugh small, behind your hand, behind a door, behind the barrel in the corner of the kitchen where no one looked unless they were hiding too. Because laughing as a servant wasn't an act of joy. It was an act of survival. You laughed at things other people wouldn't, at the absurdity, at the cruelty that crossed so far over into ridiculous. It stopped being sad, just long enough for you to breathe again. You laughed when the Lord called for his silver comb, but meant the pewter one. When the Baroness insisted that geese had been invented in the last century and couldn't be native to her lands. When the steward mispronounced imported as important, and no one dared correct him. These were the little cracks in the stone, the moments where the house let out a breath, and you slipped in your smile before it slammed shut again. But the laughter couldn't be loud. Loud meant you were drawing attention, and attention was a loaded crossbow. Nobles hated the sound of joy they didn't cause. If they didn't understand the joke, they assumed it was about them. And if it was about them, it was dangerous. You didn't laugh at nobles. You laughed with them, and only if invited. Even among servants, it was risky. Laugh too hard, and someone would accuse you of not taking your work seriously, of thinking you were above your station, of putting on airs. Because in the noble house, even happiness had a social ranking. Still, it found its way in. When a kitchen boy slipped on goose fat and flung a bowl of porridge onto a tapestry, and the tapestry looked better for it. When the cook threatened to roast the steward if he asked for just a light snack one more time. When a noble asked where their dog had gone and you realized it had been asleep under their chair for 4 hours. You learned to stifle your laughter into your sleeve, into your shoulder, into the crook of your elbow, into silence. the kind that buzzed between ribs and made your eyes water if you didn't let it out. The kind that told you, I'm still human. And that was everything. Because in a house where your name was forgotten, your body used, and your time never yours, laughter, quiet and hidden, was resistance. It was proof that the noble house hadn't stolen everything. When history remembers the medieval age, it remembers kings, queens, battles, castles, crowns. The nobles who wore velvet commanded armies and decided which village paid double taxes that year. History remembers power. It does not remember the servant who woke before the sun to heat water for a bath they would never take. It does not remember the maid who nursed the noble child through fever, while her own brother died in a straw bed 2 halls away. It does not remember the boy who hauled barrels up icy steps with cracked hands, and a stomach so empty it echoed. You were the backbone of the noble house, its lungs, its heart, its rhythm. But you were never the name in the family ledger, never the oil on the canvas, never the voice in the chapel song. You were the silence behind every noble word, the floor beneath every noble step, the invisible force that made luxury possible, and the body that paid the price. You didn't write the stories. You cleaned the ink. You didn't lead the charge. You fitted the boots. You didn't feast. You served, you poured, you bowed. And yet, without you, the whole house would collapse within a week. Because the nobles didn't know how to survive. Not really, not without you. They didn't know how to light their own fire, draw their own bath, stitch their own collar, hold their own grief. They wrapped themselves in silks you boiled clean. They walked on floors you scrubbed with your knees. They relied on you utterly, and still pretended you weren't there. They called you girl, boy, that one, you. If they remembered your name, it was for blame, never for praise. Your existence was only remarkable when you failed. But you remembered. You remembered who walked through the halls at night when no one else was awake, who took the food without asking, who cried when their husband never returned from war and pretended not to in daylight. You remembered everything, because memory was your only inheritance. You couldn't leave gold or land or portraits, but you left impressions. The way the fire was stacked, the way the linens were folded, the way the bells stopped ringing for just one breath after your final steps. You were not the story, but you were the reason it happened at all. And that matters, even if history forgets. Even if no one ever says your name again, good night.